Welcome, everybody, to our very first episode of the Denver Dzogchen Podcast. I'm your host, Damien Abel, and I'm here with our fearless leader, Joseph Wagner. And today on our episode, he's going to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about how Denver Dzogchen came to be, how he became a Buddhist, how he encountered some of his teachers like Toko Urgyen and Adzam Pelo Rinpoche. And so, we're just going to kind of float through all of that so that you have a background for everything we do in Denver Dzogchen. And then in future episodes, we'll dive deeper into various subjects having to do with Vajrayana, Dzogchen, Tantra in general. It should be a lot of fun. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks for having me. Excited.
You bet. So maybe you can start off by telling us how the Dharma started for you.
Okay. Well, I was in college in Ohio, a little school called Miami University in Southern Ohio. I'd been interested in meditation and Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism, for a long time. And I didn't know, like many people, had no idea how to get started. There was no internet then, so it was all books and, trying to call places and this kind of thing. Anyway, I had found my way to meet a fellow in Oxford, where the university is, and we were just chatting. He said, what are you interested in? And I said, you know what I'm really interested in, but I can't seem to get any information on in a personal sense, is Zen. He said, really? And I said, yeah. And I talked about, my lack of knowledge for a couple of minutes. And he said, well, we have a Zen group here in town. I said, no way, you're kidding me. He said, yeah. I said, well, I really want to join. I'm ready to start. And he said, well, it's not that easy. You've got to get approved by the person who's in charge, and it's an architecture professor. Her name is Anne Klein. And you got to call her and see. And I thought, oh, okay. I was by this point, I'm kind of nervous, right? I think I was a sophomore in college, just a young person. So I called this professor up, and she listened to me and said, well, we meet on Wednesday nights at my house. And Oxford's a tiny little town. So she invited me to come. I walked over to her house from the dorm I was living in. And I went in and found out that the group, at least that night, consisted of myself, her, and the guy who invited me. So it was just a tiny little nothing group. It flexed out to probably 5 people from time to time, but it was really just the 3 of us for all those years, the last 3 years of school. So she was a lay Zen priest in one of the Soto lineages, and was also an architecture professor and very into the Japanese tea ceremony, which she had learned in Japan. And I became her student in all kinds of things. I was a student in carpentry. I was a student in the tea ceremony, which I studied for quite a few years with her and got really into. Excuse me. And especially in Zen. And we sat every Wednesday, and I think from that moment on, I sat pretty much every day till now. I really got into it, and she became my first teacher. So that was how it really started.
Awesome. So are you still connected to her?
Unfortunately, she passed away now about, must be almost 20 years ago. Unexpectedly, she passed away. But yeah, we remained friends for the years that followed that. And yeah, she was a big inspiration to me.
That's great. So how'd you find your way over to Tibetan Buddhism?
Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. Well, from after meeting Anne, I got involved with the Cincinnati Zen Center, which at that time, one of the teachers they invited was someone from Sungsanim Sangha, that Korean Zen master, who had a place down in Kentucky. So I was in Cincinnati, studied with him a little bit, went down to Kentucky and stayed there a while. And I was pretty into Zen. Then after I graduated from college, moved to San Francisco. I sat at Tassajara. I sat at the San Francisco Zen Center. I was keeping my own daily practice going. Left San Francisco, moved to Taiwan to teach English. And there I had a really good connection. I met an Englishman, a Welshman actually, who had lived in Japan for almost 20 years studying Zen at a Zen monastery. And he had left there thinking that Japanese Zen, he thought, was a little on the formal side. It was all about family lineages, and there just wasn't a lot of growth and activity going on there. So he decided to go to Taiwan, where so many Zen practitioners and Zen masters had fled with Chiang Kai-shek when Mao took over the mainland. And I happened to meet this guy through an amazing connection that I won't go into, but he was hosting like a weekly sitting for, I don't know, it's maybe 4 or 5 hours on Sundays. And I would take my little Vespa motorcycle and drive across the mountains for where I was living to his little place and sit with him. And there was a small group, but a lot of times it was just the two of us. But he was really into it. He taught me a lot.
Mhm.
So I was there for, I don't know, almost a year and a half. And I was coming up on the end, and I told him I was going to go to Kathmandu. I really wanted to visit India, go to the Vajra seats at Bodh Gaya, and then I was going to go to Kathmandu. And he said, "Oh, you're going to Kathmandu. I really want you to meet a few people." I said, "Okay, who should I meet?" And he said, "Well, one of them is this Nepali guy named Sridhar Rana. So, and he has a teacher who you should definitely meet, who Steve, the Welshman, had met, whose name is Tulku Urgyen. Name meant absolutely nothing to me, except I knew he was Tibetan. And I said, I'm not interested in Tibetan Buddhism at all. I really love Zen. And he said, yeah, I know. He said, but you know how sometimes when you meet a Zen master, you feel like they really might have something going on? I said, yeah, I know what you mean. He said, well, when you meet a Tibetan Lama, you know they know. And that put a little hook in me. So when I got to Kathmandu, I looked up Sridhar Rana, who at that time was practicing as a student of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, but was a very senior student and had been practicing. First, he was a Shaiva renunciant who visited the charnel grounds every night for many years, and then he was practicing Zen under a couple different teachers and had an authorization to teach and was running 7-day retreats in Kathmandu and had all these students. And then he ran the string out on that, he felt, so he decided to get into Tibetan Buddhism, and he met Tulku Urgyen and became his student. He had other teachers, but at that time, Tulku Urgyen was his main teacher, and this guy was super impressive. I had been carrying around various questions that for a couple of years that no one seemed to be able to answer, and he answered all those questions as if he had prepared for the interview. It was pretty amazing, and he said, you should meet Tulku Urgyen. And so I have a whole story about how that happened, but that was my introduction.
Okay. So do you remember any of those questions that you asked him?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that the other day, and I can't remember any of them. I don't think they would be very interesting nowadays.
Yeah.
They were probably fairly simple questions, but at the time, they were things that I was really grappling with, and he answered those like that's what he thought about every day. It was very impressive. He impressed me. He seemed to know everything, and I had never met anybody who had such a deep education. He also spoke Sanskrit, and he was a very educated person and
Yeah.
deep practice, even at that time. And since then, he's gone on to do more than 20 years of strict retreat, and he has a huge sangha in Nepal. So interesting guy.
Wow. Yeah. So I know on Tara's Triple Excellence, you already told the full story of your meeting of Tulku Urgyen, but maybe you can give us the summary version for us, just for new
Yeah,
people.
sure. Yeah, it was a cool story. I mean, it shows the power of some of those Tibetan lamas. So I wanted to buy a statue in Kathmandu, and statues are everywhere there. There's a lot of solid artistry going on in Nepal still to this day. In fact, it seems to be quite a bit better. So I had found this beautiful statue, which is actually made by Siddhi Raj, who's the sort of grandfather of all the statue makers. He's like the king, and this was a handmade statue by him, which I went a little bit over my budget, but I bought this little statue, and so I took it to show to Sridhar. He was sort of my guide at this point, and I said, "What should I do?" And he said, "Well, you need to have this blessed by a lama. I think you should go see Tulku Urgyen." And at the time, I was taking some classes, a sort of course with Tulku Urgyen's eldest son, Chokanima, which was a couple weeks long. One day, I got the instructions from Sridhar about how to go see Tulku Urgyen, who was staying at the power place of Parping. They have a monastery out there, which is a place where Guru Padmasambhava practiced. And it was, nowadays it's practically in Kathmandu because the city's grown up so much. But this was 1993, and it was way out. And so I had to negotiate with a taxi driver, and I went out there, and arrived at this crossroads, just dirt crossroads. There's nothing there. Nowadays, it's full of monasteries. It's been built up terrifically, but at that time it was just a tiny village. And I got out of the taxi. Of course, I have no idea where to go. I just have this bag with my statue. I'm kind of looking around, and I see this Tibetan nun, and she's just an Ani, right? And so I walked up to her and I said, Toku Orjin. Of course, I speak absolutely no Tibetan. She said, Toku Orjin. And we had this communing moment, even though I had no idea about him. Excuse me. And she kind of took me by the hand and she led me up this path. We walked for a few minutes and up to this this monastery, this tiny monastery, and there was a little gateway, and she said, she was just gesturing, said Toku Orjin. So I didn't know what to do. I just started to walk in there, and this fellow showed up who turned out to be German. His name was Andreas, and he was supposed to be out there with Toku Orjin, and Sridhar had knew he was out there and said, just ask for Andreas. I said, hi, are you Andreas? He said, yes. Joe Wagner, Sridhar Rana sent me to meet Toku Orjin. He said, okay. And then he kind of leaned back and he moved this curtain on this door and he said something in Tibetan. And then he looked at me and he said, Rinpoche, we'll see you now. I had no idea what to do, right? I just knew I was supposed to offer this white scarf, this kata, and I was going to try to get my statue blessed. So I went in and I don't know what happened. I made a couple of prostrations. I gave my kata and I felt like I was in a trance. I couldn't put it together. My mind had sort of ceased to work, which was, in retrospect, is sort of something that, I don't know, you hear about in other stories. But at the time, I had absolutely no idea. I'd only met Chokadima Rinpoche, who I liked very much. I thought he was very sweet and terrifically knowledgeable. But this guy was something different. He literally blew my mind. So I got the statue out and I explained to Andreas that I wanted to have the statue blessed. And it had a Tibetan style Nepali statues, the metal statues have a little plate in the bottom that you have to have removed. Of course, I had no idea about that. Now, this one had a little hole in the center, but the plate was in place. And so I just explained to Andreas about it and offered the statue to Toku Orjin, and he looked at it and he turned it over and he noticed that the plate was in place and he looked at me and he said, my monks aren't blacksmiths. I mean, he said it in Tibetan, but Andreas said, Rinpoche says his monks aren't blacksmiths. And I don't know what was enclosed inside of that phrase, but my mind went completely, I would have called it at the time blank, but now I would say it was so open, I could not give rise to any thoughts. I was just like, and I think my face was like that because they both sort of started to laugh. And Rinpoche said, don't worry, it's no problem. Then he took a little dutsi or something and he put it in that hole. And then he blew on it. He said a few mantras and he gave back to me. He said, I think this is going to be fine for you. And I was like, And Andreas said, okay, see you next time. And kind of pushed me out. I went out and I just sat down on kind of a bench there. And I was just sitting there being like, whoa, I could not get it together. And this monk happened along who spoke a little English, and he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from America. And he said, Chicago. And I said, Chicago? Okay, yeah. I was not from Chicago, but I was like, no, Chicago. And he said, and he looked at me for a second, and he kind of pointed back toward where Toku Orjin's room was, and he said, big city. And I thought he meant that Chicago was a big city. Later, when I explained this story to Sridhar, he laughed and he said, no, Siddhi, like magical power, because he had seen that my mind was totally blown. And I couldn't get it together for more than 24 hours. I went back and the woman I was traveling with, I tried to explain to her what happened and I just spontaneously started to cry and I didn't know what happened. I just got my mind blown. And that really put the hook in me for real. So then I asked to become Rinpoche's student, and he very kindly accepted that. And I've been doing that stuff ever since. That's what happened.
That's great. So maybe we can fast forward a little bit to how you started Denver Dzogchen. How did that come about after encountering Dzogchen and Tokyo Origin and practicing and doing Nundro and all of that? How did
Mm.
that lead to this group?
Um, well, it was a lot later, and I met another great master named Adzim Pelo Rinpoche, who lives most of the time in Chamdo, but because of, believe it or not, another Anne Klein, the famous Anne Klein who teaches at Rice University. Um, because of her, another Anne Klein in my Buddhist world and history, I got to meet Rinpoche. I'm trying to think of how much of the story to tell. I tell a little bit more than just nothing. So I got a call one day, and it was from Anne. And I had never met her. I didn't know her at all. I knew her name, and she asked me if I could come to the airport because Adzim Rinpoche was going to be flying into Denver, and she was getting in after his flight arrived, and she was worried because he was traveling just with his sister and cousin. None of them speak English, that they would be kind of confused, and they had just come all the way from China and they would be tired. And could I come and just help them get to the next gate and meet up with her? And I said, sure. Yeah. I thought it was cool. So we went out to the airport, and this was before 9/11, so we could go to the gate. And Rinpoche came off the plane. He looked like he had been resting very well. He's a big guy, and his energy is really big. And met him and gave a kata and all the standard stuff, and met up with Anne. And Rinpoche wanted to know about me, and I told a little bit. And I spontaneously we went over to his gate, and just before he boarded, I said he was on his way to teach at Taramandala down in Pagosa Springs in southern Colorado, Soltram Alioni's place. And I wasn't signed up to go to the retreat, but I felt so inspired. I said, Rinpoche, I can't come to the retreat, but could I just come and see you while I'm there and receive the sem tree? This is what he refers to as the mind guidance. This is the main thing that he does. Is he has this amazing willingness to meet with every student individually, and give you instruction based on where you were. And he said, yeah, you have to come. You must come. So I went down there with another friend, and that in itself is an amazing story. But to make it short, I had an interview, and during that interview, I got my mind blown again. And of course, I was a student of other lamas and had met many people, but Adzim Pelo Rinpoche is an amazing being. He's a real siddha, and totally blew me away. And your new name is Origin Rungdrol, and all this kind of crazy stuff that only he can pull off. So I felt like, oh, I've found a teacher. Since then, Tokyo Origin had passed away, and I was kind of didn't know exactly what I was supposed to be doing with my path and this kind of thing. So that cleared that up. And if you fast forward maybe 2 years after that or so, we were at another retreat with him, and everyone was meeting for their interview. And I went and had my interview, and Anne was translating, and I got up to leave. I was almost at the door, and Anne said, hold on a second. And then I went back in, and Rinpoche said, so you live in Denver, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I want you to start a group and start teaching in Denver. And I was like, Rinpoche. I put my hands together. I was like, Rinpoche, please don't ask me to do this. I don't have a place. I don't know anything. I'm not the guy to do this. I can't run a center. What are you talking about? I'm a yogi, and I want to practice. And then Anne translated this, and Rinpoche started laughing. He said, I'm not asking. And I was like, okay, so I guess we're going to do that. So I was trying to figure out how to get out of this, and I went out and went to the bathroom. And when I came out of the bathroom, there was a guy there, and he said, are you Joe? And I said, yeah. He said, I'm Tom Nelson. I hear we're starting a group in Denver, and you're going to be the leader. I was like, I can't escape. So he became the first member, and he's still a member now. And
Mm-hmm.
that's how we started it. That was 22 years ago. We for a long time we were meeting in person only, and then when the pandemic happened, we switched to online, and now it's fully online with occasional in-person activities. But that's the situation. 20 years later.
That's amazing. Yeah, and the group is formed into a very well-oiled machine that you kind of go through cycles of teaching each year, and yeah, it's always growing, new people coming. Maybe you can fast forward a little bit more and tell us just kind of about where the group is now and kind of what we're doing and what you're offering and what your intention is with.
Good question. I'm just trying to carry out the wishes of my gurus. I've got another teacher, a Tibetan in Tibet, who also wrote a letter and forced me to promise I would continue to share the dharma to whatever limited ability I have. And so I've been doing that. And it was much more of just a sitting group for a long time, but now it has morphed into more. I feel like my main opportunity is to share the teachings I've received that have made the most difference in my own practice. Because I still am a yogi. I'm not a guru. I consider myself, I guess, a Kalyana Mitra, like a spiritual friend, someone who can help those people who have questions that I happen to know the answer to, which is not every question, but I'm working on it. And that consists of all sorts of stuff. I mean, I sort of consider that there are certain basic practices that all Vajrayana practitioners should know how to do. And that starts with the 4 thoughts that change the mind and that turn the mind. And so we go over that, and we kind of rotate through these things again and again. It depends on what's inspiring me, or if there are certain questions, or maybe somebody new has come and they need to know where we're at. Then we kind of go through things from the beginning. But from the 4 thoughts all the way through the Nundro, I myself have done quite a bit of Nundro, and I think it's extremely powerful and I love it. And so I encourage people who are involved in our group to do that. And it's not a requirement, but when everybody's doing something, people get into it. And so I give a lot of teachings about the Nundro and how to approach these big practices, because it takes several years to do the Nundro for most people who aren't in a full-time retreat, even if you are. And so we do all the basic stuff and then talk about sadhanas. And sometimes I give reading transmissions for various practices, teach the basics of things like POA, like transference of consciousness. I feel like that's really crucial since we never know when we're going to go, and to have a clear and easy path to the pure realm is wise, it seems. So a lot of that kind of stuff. And then the basis is the instructions that I've received from all my teachers, but I primarily feel that the lineage of Tulku Orjin and his instructions on meditating in the Dzogchen style and the nature of mind are the most precious thing that I have. And I try to share that to whatever degree I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's kind of a unique group because it's not necessarily like for beginners, because generally you're going to already have received empowerment from another teacher, and have some experience or knowledge of the Dharma. So for people who are watching this who might be interested in the group, we've laid out a bit of a pathway if you are interested in joining. Could you kind of spell that out for us?
About the requirements for being part.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. There are really only 3 requirements. There used to be no requirements because I've shown up. But as the teachings have gotten more profound, I feel like my Samaya needs to be considered. And I don't want to be spoiling people's situation or my own. So right now, to be there, you have to be a Buddhist. You have to have received empowerment. And you have to read something about Vajrayana if you're coming from another form of Buddhism. Um, in terms of being a Buddhist, I personally don't think it's that important that you've had a formal refuge ceremony, but you have to be able to say, I'm a Buddhist, and whatever that means for you. I mean, some people are Buddhists, but they're also, coming from a Jewish background or a Christian background. And, I don't think there's too much complication there. So that's probably the main thing. And
Mm-hmm.
then because the door to the Vajrayana is empowerment, and I don't want to give empowerments, it's good for people to receive empowerment. So people have to do that either with another teacher. Well, I mean, obviously with another teacher, but can also do that with Garchen Rinpoche. He's been extremely generous in giving a lot of empowerments online. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a possibility. And then we usually have people read, there are many books, but my personal favorite is The Tantric Mysticism of Tibet by John Blofeld, because I just love John Blofeld. And it's a good overview. It's an older book, but he had a lot of devotion and it comes through in the pages. Those are the
Yeah.
only requirements, and a genuine interest in being part of an active group where the real goal of the group, of everybody in the group, at least if I can say this for everyone, is to try to directly experience and then deepen their own understanding of their mind nature. That's the
Yeah.
whole and all these other practices, whether it's the various types of sleep and dream yogas or tumo or sky gazing, they're all a support for coming to see who we really are in our own core and become more and more accustomed to abiding within that state of spacious openness. And that's what I learned from Tolkien Orchin, and that's what I'm practicing every day, and what I think everybody in Vajrayana should be practicing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, what I find so magical about the group is, I've attended hundreds and hundreds of teachings and meditation groups and with different lamas, but what this group feels like, it's like a circle of yogis who've been practicing together, like the old school style in Tibet, who a bunch of yogis who've received instruction and now are practicing. And so that's like the really strong effect I get is every week when we meet, I get that connection on these deeper practices. And it's not just let's listen to the teacher give instruction, and then like tends to be kind of intellectual. It's really practice oriented, which I really enjoy, and there's a lot of feedback and people can ask you questions and get support from the group. So it's been fantastic for me in terms of having sangha, especially in a modern world where it's really hard to have a good solid physical sangha. So it's been a digital sangha. I'm up in Seattle and have my main sangha being in Denver, so that's the magic of the internet. And so just to tease the future of this podcast, so there's a brief introduction to Joe and Denver Dzogchen, but I think in the future it's going to be really fun. We'll go into some of these topics, like the amazing things like, so Joe also owns City Energetics, and Future Alchemy, which is a Tibetan medicine website and a website that deals in all kinds of really fun alchemist and tantric substances, that you may or may not know something about. So there's just a ton to flesh out there. Also talking about maybe some of these practices and some of the philosophy, and some of the different caveats and schools within Tibetan Buddhism. So I think there's just a ton that Jove and I have talked about over the last year, and we're going to try and turn those into podcast episodes. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Thank you so much for doing this with us, Joe.
Pleasure.
And we'll be releasing these fairly regularly over the next coming months. So I look forward to future episodes. Thanks for having us.
Wonderful.